Right now you are about to hear the shocking story of one of the most feared, most ruthless, and most unpredictable gangsters America has ever known. A man who spread terror across banks, police departments, and entire cities, yet somehow became a hero to thousands of poor families who had nothing left during the Great Depression. What you are about to hear will shake you emotionally and make you rethink everything you know about good and evil. His name was Pretty Boy Floyd, the handsome face of the most brutal street justice the United States had ever seen. The man who robbed more banks than any outlaw of his time, killed police officers in cold blood, walked out of traps prepared by the FBI without fear, burned mortgage bonds and debt records to save families from eviction, and made the most powerful financial institutions in America tremble at the sound of his name. Subscribe to our channel, and we continue. Pretty Boy Floyd did not start his life as a criminal. He started as a son of the soil, born on an Oklahoma farm where the land was dry, the wind was cruel, and the only certainty was hunger. Children learn to work before they learn to read, and Floyd understood early that life rewarded strength, not innocence. The Great Depression turned millions of families into beggars overnight. Banks threw desperate people into the streets, and Floyd watched his neighbors lose everything while the law protected the rich. That was the world that created him. His first robbery was not an act of glory, it was survival. He stole to feed his family. But what began as necessity transformed into power. When Floyd stepped into a bank for the first time with a gun in his hand, he didn't look frightened. He looked calm. He walked to the counter as if he was there to cash a check, fired a warning shot into the ceiling, and said in a steady voice that no one should move. That calm became the most terrifying part about him. He never shouted, never shook, never hesitated. While other criminals made chaos, Floyd moved like a businessman collecting a debt. And with every robbery, newspapers printed more headlines. They called him a monster, a killer, a public enemy. But in the fields and small towns across America, the poor whispered a different story. The story of the outlaw who forced bankers to open vaults containing mortgage deeds and debt notes and handed those documents back to the families who were about to lose their homes forever. Farmers who were days away from eviction suddenly had their futures returned by a man with a gun. The police hunted him. The poor protected him. In one city, a group of workers blocked a road with hay wagons to slow police cars long enough for Floyd to escape across the fields. In another town, a family hid him in their barn even though they knew the reward for turning him in could have fed them for years. When reporters asked why they risked everything to protect a killer, a farmer answered, "The banks killed us first." Floyd lived in constant motion. Fields, barns, safe houses, farms, cheap motels, stolen cars. He slept with a rifle beside him, woke up before sunrise, and trusted no one except the men who shared his outlaw life. But unlike other gangsters driven by greed, Floyd operated by rules that only made his legend larger. He never stole from people in the bank lobby. He never touched children. He never allowed violence against civilians unless someone drew a gun on him first. Yet he showed no mercy to law enforcement. Officers who tried to stop him rarely survived the attempt. And when the FBI stepped into the hunt, the story changed forever. The director of the FBI labeled Floyd the most dangerous outlaw in the country and demanded that his capture become a national priority. He assigned the relentless agent Melvin Purvis to bring Floyd down, the same man who later hunted John Dillinger. And from that moment, the United States turned into a battleground between Floyd and the government. Roadblocks appeared on highways. Trains were searched. Farmlands were raided. Newspapers printed his face every morning. But the more the authorities hunted him, the more support he gained from the working poor. For them, he was not just a man, he was revenge against the system. And every time a bank burned, every time debt papers disappeared, every time a sheriff's department reported a failed ambush, another small town began to whisper his name with admiration, not fear. Floyd became a symbol none of them intended to create, the man who fought back when no one else could. And that symbol was more dangerous than any bullet. Because bullets kill people. Symbols build legends. And Pretty Boy Floyd was no longer just a criminal hiding from the law, he was a legend walking the earth. And the government was terrified of what that legend meant. Floyd was born Charles Arthur Floyd in 1904 in the red dirt and harsh sun of rural Georgia, but his childhood truly belonged to the hard fields of Oklahoma, where his family moved in search of land that might finally feed them instead of breaking them. His father was a tenant farmer, the kind of man who came home every night with dust in his lungs and failure in his eyes, because the soil, the banks, and the weather all seemed to be in a secret conspiracy against him. From the time he could stand, little Charlie worked the rows like an adult, dragging burlap sacks, picking cotton until his fingers bled, pushing plows behind tired mules. There were no childhood dreams in those fields, only calluses and hunger. By the time he was a teenager, he had already learned the two rules of his world. The bank always wins, and no one is coming to save you. When the first real droughts hit and the prices of crops dropped so low they were practically worth less than the sweat it took to plant them, the Floyd family began to drown in debt. Men from the bank arrived with clean suits, clipboards, and cold eyes, walking around the property and measuring their future in numbers. They did not see lives. They saw defaulted loans and collateral. Charlie watched his father standing on the porch, hat in hand, nodding and pleading in a quiet, humiliated voice, and something inside him hardened. Weeks later, they received a notice: pay now or lose the farm. But how do you pay with dust and broken tools? The answer was simple. You don't. You lose everything. That was the road most families walked. But Charlie Floyd stepped off that road. His first robbery was almost clumsy in its simplicity. He was just a teenager when he and a couple of local boys held up a small payroll delivery in a nearby town. There was no grand plan, no gang with a name, no machine guns, just cheap revolvers and trembling hands. Yet when the money bag tore open and banknotes spilled onto the dirt road, he felt something far more powerful than fear. He felt control, for the first time in his life. They were caught. Of course, such amateur work rarely goes unnoticed for long. Floyd was arrested and sent away, tasting the inside of a prison cell while most boys his age were still trying to decide what to do with their lives. Iron bars have a way of stripping illusions from a man, and in that suffocating, sweaty, violent world, Charlie Floyd came to a decision. If the law was willing to crush him and everyone he loved to protect a bank's numbers on a ledger, then he owed the law nothing. When he came out, he promised himself that if he was to be branded a criminal, he would become one of the best. He drifted between jobs, oil fields, harvest crews, odd work for anyone who would pay, but every time he passed a bank, something tightened in his jaw. Inside, he knew, were the same kind of men who had almost taken his family's farm, and who were now throwing other families onto the road with the same indifference. And so, slowly, his path curved back toward crime. The man who returned to robbery was not a scared boy anymore. He was lean, sharp, watchful, with a face that made people trust him and eyes that made wise men nervous. He started small. A grocery store here, a gas station there, always careful, always fast. But the banks were his true targets. He studied them like a farmer studies the sky. Every detail mattered. When the guards changed, when the manager arrived, where the safe was, how long it stayed open during business hours. Floyd was not a wild gunslinger who trusted chance. He was a strategist. When he walked through the doors of a bank now, it was with a quiet confidence that seemed almost polite. "This is a robbery," he would say, in a calm, measured voice, as if he were giving directions. "Nobody needs to get hurt." People listened because something in him made them believe he meant it. But the legend of Pretty Boy Floyd did not grow from politeness. It grew from what he did next. In more than one bank, after the clerks had stuffed money into the sacks and the manager had surrendered his keys to the vault, Floyd would point to the shelves stacked with documents, mortgages, liens, debt papers with signatures of desperate families who had borrowed against their future and lost. "Those," he would say. "Bring me those." Confused employees obeyed, stacking boxes and bundles of paper on the floor. And then Floyd would draw a match, strike it, and set the future of half the town on fire. Flames climbed up the stacks of paper as clerks and customers watched in stunned silence. Decades of debt, threats, and legal bondage turned to ash in a matter of minutes. People who had been one court order away from eviction watched everything that chained them to the banks disappear up the chimney. Word about this spread faster than any wanted poster. In the eyes of the government, he was a dangerous armed robber. In the eyes of people living in shacks and half-plowed fields, he was something else entirely, an avenger with a gun and a strange, brutal sense of justice. It was around this time that the newspapers gave him the nickname that would cling to him forever: Pretty Boy Floyd. The name came from a smiling photograph taken when he was still barely more than a boy, all sharp cheekbones and clear eyes, his hair slicked back in the fashion of the time. A woman who saw the picture is said to have remarked, "The pretty boy," and a reporter, always hungry for a catchy phrase, picked it up like gold. The nickname was almost a joke to Floyd at first. He hated it. He wanted to be seen as dangerous, not handsome. But the name stuck, and soon mothers were whispering it to children as a ghost story and waitresses were saying it with a secret smile when a stranger left too large a tip. That contrast, the soft nickname and the hard man behind it, only added fuel to his legend. As the Great Depression deepened, Floyd's robberies became more frequent and more daring. Banks had become hated symbols everywhere, places where men in suits sat in warm offices while thousands slept in tents under bridges. Every time Floyd hit a bank, it felt to many like a blow against an invisible enemy. And yet, he had rules. He did not shoot unarmed people. He did not allow his men to rough up customers. When someone panicked and tried to be a hero, he would shout them down rather than pull the trigger, preferring humiliation over unnecessary bloodshed. Money belongs to the bank, he would say. Your life belongs to you. Don't mix them up. But when it came to lawmen, there was no mercy. Floyd had been beaten by deputies, threatened by sheriffs, and humiliated by small-town cops long before the FBI put him on their lists. In his mind, any officer who stepped into the line of fire had already chosen a side. More than once, when cornered on a country road or in a dark alley, Floyd answered bullets with bullets, and the officers who underestimated him did not go home. These shootouts deepened the government's hatred of him and hardened their resolve to see him buried, but they also fed something strange in the public imagination. Here was a man who faced down the government's guns and survived. Here was someone who refused to bow his head. In a country that felt kicked in the teeth by banks and politicians, that meant something. Stories about him traveled down railroad lines with drifters, across campfires in hobo jungles, and through whispered conversations on church steps after Sunday service. Some of those stories were lies, some were exaggerations, but all of them had the same core. Pretty Boy Floyd robs banks, burns mortgage papers, and slips away from the law like a ghost. The FBI took those same stories and used them as fuel in their own campaign. Under J. Edgar Hoover, the Bureau was rebuilding its reputation after numerous failures and embarrassments. They needed enemies to defeat, names that frightened the public so they could ride in as heroes. Floyd's name was perfect for the role. Handsome, dangerous, already known in the newspapers. They called him Public Enemy Number 1, painting him as an almost demonic figure who killed for pleasure and robbed without conscience. Photographs of his face were printed on wanted posters, pinned inside post offices and sheriff's offices from Oklahoma to Ohio. Bulletins describe him as armed and extremely dangerous, a man who would rather die than surrender. This portrayal contained just enough truth to be convincing. Floyd truly had no intention of going quietly. Yet the Bureau's image of him left out the poor families that owed him their homes, the farmers who had seen him cross their land with a rifle in his hands and leave without taking a single thing from their table. In the shadows just outside the newspaper narratives, a quiet war was being fought, not just between Floyd and the law, but between two versions of his story. Somewhere in the dust and gunpowder, the man and the myth fused together into something neither side fully controlled anymore. Every time a deputy fell in a shootout or a bank vault door was found blasted open, the legend of Pretty Boy Floyd grew stronger, and with it grew the determination of the government to end him, no matter the cost. By the early 1930s, Floyd's life had narrowed into a sharp line that ran from one bank vault to the next, crossing state borders like they were pencil marks on a map. The Great Depression turned whole regions into graveyards of broken dreams, and in that landscape Floyd moved like a storm. He traveled in fast cars that chewed up the endless miles of Midwest Highway, usually a Ford V8 that could outrun almost anything the local sheriffs could muster. At his side, there was almost always a small, rotating circle of men who trusted him enough to share a front seat with him. George Birdwell, Pat Charrington, Ralston Rags Fraley, rough men with quick trigger fingers and quicker tempers. But whatever their backgrounds, once they were in his car, they were his crew, and his rules applied. Floyd insisted on planning every job down to the minute. He studied blueprints when he could get them, watched banks for days, sometimes weeks. He took note of the nearest dirt roads, the soft shoulders where a car could disappear, the tree lines where a man could vanish in seconds. He knew which towns had sympathetic sheriffs and which ones would throw everything they had at him the moment the alarm bell rang. More than once he walked into a bank days before a robbery, dressed in clean overalls, pretending to ask about opening a small savings account. His eyes never stopped moving, counting steps from the door to the teller line, to the manager's office, to the vault. Later, sitting under the thin shade of an oak somewhere outside town, he would go over the layout from memory, drawing rough maps in the dirt with a stick while his partners listened in silence. "Nobody gets hurt unless they earn it," he would say, jabbing the stick into the ground where the guards usually stood. We take the money, we burn the paper, and we get out. Fast. Their first major jobs under the system were in small Oklahoma towns that barely appeared on larger maps. Sallisaw, Earlsboro, Meeker, Shamrock. To most of America, these places meant nothing. To the people living in them, they were the whole world, and nearly every one of those worlds was held by the throat by some bank with tall pillars and a smug manager. In town after town, Floyd's crew rolled in just after opening time, when the staff was in place and the vault unlocked but the lobby still empty enough to control. He preferred calm over chaos. A sudden, cold hands up, and a thump of boots on polished floor. Pistols leveled but not yet barking. The terrified clerks learned quickly that it was better to obey than to be heroes. Cash drawers emptied. Bills shoved into sacks. And then the same strange ritual. Those papers, Floyd would say, nodding toward the back shelves stacked with shoeboxes of foreclosure notices and promissory notes. Bring them. Sometimes a manager would argue, insisting that the money was all they wanted. But Floyd's eyes were harder than any vault door, and the argument never lasted long. A few minutes later, those papers would be in a pile on the floor, and the first tongue of fire would lick across the bottom edges. There was a savage poetry in the way those flames climbed. Men and women watched, wide-eyed, as the debts that had been suffocating them crumbled into ash. Outside the banks, he moved with a surprising gentleness. When his car rattled down a farm track for a shortcut, people came out onto porches, shielding their eyes against the sun to see who was passing. Sometimes they recognized him. The stories had traveled ahead. "You pretty Boy Floyd?" a thin man once asked, standing barefoot in front of a house that was more holes than boards. Floyd did not answer directly. He just looked past the man, into the doorway, where a woman stood with a baby on her hip, 2 more children clinging to her skirt. On a crate near the door lay a folded paper with the bank stamp on it, a notice demanding payment they would never be able to make. Floyd walked over, picked up the paper, read the words he knew too well. Final warning. "How much do you owe on this place?" he asked. The farmer swallowed, ashamed. "More than I can pay," he muttered. "They'll take it next month." Floyd folded the notice carefully and slid it into his coat. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a roll of bills, and pressed it into the man's hand. "You didn't get this from me," he said quietly. And if they ask about that notice, he let the sentence hang. The implication was clear. There were other stories like that, scattered like seeds across the Midwest. A stranger who paid off a mortgage in cash and disappeared. A gunman who left behind a bag of groceries instead of taking something. To lawmen, these stories were infuriating. They complicated the clean lines of good and evil. To ordinary people, they were lifelines. Songs began to appear, ballads sung in rough voices over cheap guitars beside railroad tracks and in back rooms of bars where bottles were shared because there was no money to buy another round. His name was woven into lyrics alongside railroads and dust storms, the outlaw who shot back at the law and fed those who were hungry. The more the FBI called him a monster, the more people spoke of him like a folk hero. When the Bureau finally placed him at the top of their wanted list, they did it with a mix of fear and calculation. Every new bulletin that went out painted him as more ruthless than the last, emphasizing every lawman killed, every bullet fired. But they could not stop the way the stories spread in the opposite direction. In some towns, a sheriff might quietly just miss him when tips came in, arriving at a safe house a little too late, finding a coffee pot still warm on the stove, a cigarette still burning in an ashtray. Sometimes this was incompetence, but not always. There were lawmen who had seen families tossed into ditches while banks kept their profits, and who found it difficult to put their full heart into catching the man who burned mortgage papers. For every sheriff who swore to bring him in, there was a deputy who wondered what it would feel like to do what Floyd was doing. The FBI could not afford that kind of ambiguity. They needed the country to believe in the danger of Pretty Boy Floyd. And so Hoover's men began to stitch together every unsolved robbery, every dead officer within a 3-state radius and attach them, one by one, to Floyd's name. If a bank was hit in Kansas, Floyd was suspected. If a payroll car vanished in Arkansas, Floyd's name appeared in the report. Even when he was hundreds of miles away, he became the shadow blamed for every crime that frightened people. Slowly, his real deeds were buried under a growing pile of accusations. For a while, this actually helped him. A myth is easier to steer than a known man. Witnesses contradicted each other when describing him. Some said he was tall, others said he was short, some claimed his hair was dark, others insisted it was lighter. Only one detail was always the same. He moved like a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and he never seemed panicked. That coolness was his shield. On the road, he adapted to a life where a single mistake could be fatal. He became a master of the quick change, swapping license plates between cars at dawn, cutting his hair, dyeing it, shaving, growing a mustache. He used false names at boarding houses, stayed just long enough to rest and eat before moving on. He smiled easily with strangers but revealed nothing. The women in his orbit complicated the picture even further. He married young, trying for a time to balance the life of a husband and father with the life of a wanted man, but the strain was impossible. As his legend grew, so did the danger to anyone close to him. A quiet supper could turn into a gunfight if the wrong person recognized him. The law had begun to understand that when they could not find him, they might find those he loved. Floyd refused to give them that leverage. And yet, he was not made of stone. There were nights when he sat in cheap hotel rooms staring at a photograph of his son, finger tracing the outline of a small face he rarely saw. Loneliness in his life was as constant as the weight of the gun at his side. That loneliness was briefly interrupted when he found a kind of rough companionship in the criminals' network that stretched along the railroads and state highways. Men like him shared safe houses and information, swapping rumors about which towns were getting new guards, which sheriffs were hiring fresh deputies, which banks were moving large sums of cash. They drank together, fought, made uneasy alliances. Sometimes they betrayed each other. In that world, trust was as fragile as glass. Someone always talked when the pain of an interrogation grew too sharp or the promise of leniency sounded too sweet. Floyd knew this and kept his true thoughts locked tight behind a calm face. And still, even among thieves, he stood apart. While others boasted about killings and robberies, Floyd spoke little about his jobs. When alcohol loosened tongues, his remained disciplined. When someone bragged that they had beaten a clerk during a robbery, he would stare at them with a coldness that silenced the table. No need for that, he would say. Fear is enough. You don't need blood to make a point. In private, some of those men admitted that Floyd scared them more than the law did. It wasn't the violence. There were crueler men on the road than him. It was his clarity. He knew exactly what he was doing and why, and that made him dangerously resolved. The killings of officers that did happen around him were rarely accidents. When Floyd shot, it was because he truly believed there was no other way out. Eventually, the string of dead lawmen began to circle back on him like a noose. There is no government in the world that can tolerate being openly defied without responding, and by 1933 that response was sharpening into something personal. Hoover wanted a victory, something visible and undeniable he could hold up as proof that his bureau was not just a letterhead but a hammer. Dillinger, Nelson, Bonney, and Clyde, they were all on lists, but Floyd had a special place. He was the one whose name farmers sang and whose myth they told their children by lantern light. Taking him down would be more than an arrest, it would be a message. In this tightening game, every bank Floyd approached, every road he drove down, carried more risk than the last. The circles on the map where he could hide grew smaller as federal agents coordinated with local forces, sharing information in ways they hadn't a decade earlier. Airplanes joined the hunt, scanning open fields and back roads from above. Telephones linked sheriff's offices across state lines. The modern world was closing in on the old-style outlaw, and Floyd knew it. But knowing a storm is coming and being able to outrun it are two different things. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He kept moving, kept robbing, kept tossing match after match onto piles of mortgage papers, watched the smoke rise like a dark prayer against a country that had turned its own citizens into refugees. With every job, with every narrow escape, his name dug itself deeper into the soil of America, a name uttered with curses in federal offices and with quiet gratitude in cabins lit by a single, flickering lamp. By 1933, the roads that had once felt wide open to Floyd began to narrow into deadly corridors, lined not just with dust and telephone poles, but with eyes and rifles and men who had been told that bringing him in would make their careers. The turning point came in the form of a roar of gunfire that echoed far beyond the streets where it happened, the Kansas City Union Station shootout, the massacre that would stain his name forever, whether he truly deserved it or not. On the morning of June 17th, a group of gangsters stormed the station to free a prisoner. Pretty Boy Floyd stamped onto half the rumors even before the smoke had cleared. A car rolled up, men stepped out with machine guns, and in seconds 4 lawmen and their prisoner lay dead on the concrete, blood soaking into the tracks as passengers screamed and threw themselves to the floor. Photographs of the aftermath splashed across front pages nationwide. Bodies beside automobiles, shattered glass, bullet-pocked stone. The Bureau needed a face to pin it on, and Floyd, already a symbol of the outlaw era, was the easiest target. Hoover seized on the moment like a man starving for proof of his own warnings. Almost overnight, Floyd's name went from bank robber to cop killer in bold print. His already hefty file thickened with accusations typed in precise, unforgiving lines. Whether he had been in Kansas City that morning or not stopped mattering. Inside the Bureau's offices, he was there. In the minds of frightened citizens reading about dead federal agents, he was there. In the speeches Hoover gave to justify more power, more agents, more guns, he was there. And once the government decides you're the ghost behind its nightmares, every shadow you cast becomes a threat that must be erased. Floyd felt the shift in the air even without the newspapers. Safe houses that had always been open to him cooled. Men who once greeted him with handshakes began glancing over his shoulder, measuring windows and doors with their eyes. In parlors and barrooms, voices lowered when he walked in. "They're saying it was you," a friendly bartender murmured one night, sliding a drink across the counter. Floyd took it without looking down, his jaw clenched, the muscle twitching. "They say a lot of things," he answered, but the words tasted bitter. In quiet moments, hunched over a table where maps and cigarette burns competed for space, he wondered if the myth that had protected him was now working against him, turning each stray bullet fired by some desperate kid into another crime pinned on Pretty Boy. Yet if there was fear inside him, he refused to let it show. He still traveled those same back roads, still slept in farmhouses where children crept from their beds to peek at the outlaw in their kitchen, eyes wide with the thrilling terror of being near a man whose face was in the papers. He still pulled up in front of banks when the conditions suited him, still stepped through doors with that same calm, weapons drawn but steady. "This isn't about blood," he would say, voice low but clear enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. "Do as you're told and nobody dies." Most of the time, he meant it. Most of the time, it stayed true. But the circle of lawmen around him was tightening, their guns more numerous, their tactics more modern, and the days when a car and a fast trigger finger were enough to stay ahead of them were ending. Radio dispatches, telephones, and shared files meant that a description given in one town could be waiting for him in the next before he even crossed the county line. The Depression had taught the country to move faster than its pain. Now it was teaching the law to move faster than its fugitives. More and more, Floyd found himself driving deep into the night, headlights off, trusting to moonlight and memory. He avoided bigger cities, cutting through smaller and smaller towns until he was passing through places that didn't even have names on most maps, just clusters of houses, sagging barns, and abandoned gas stations standing like busted teeth along the roadway. In those small pockets of America, he was still our boy, still the one who burned the notices and cursed the bankers, still the man rumored to have fed starving families in the dead of winter. Farmers left food on back steps and swore they knew nothing when men in suits came asking questions. Old women clutched rosaries and insisted they hadn't seen him, even if heads slept in their spare rooms. Poor people who had nothing else to protect kept his legend safe, as if it were their last piece of dignity. For them, the FBI badge was not automatically a symbol of goodness. Sometimes it was just another emblem of far-off power that had done nothing but bring them pain. Yet for every door that stayed open to Floyd, there was another that slammed shut, another former ally who decided that the bounty on his head, or the fear of federal retaliation, was worth more than whatever loyalty they felt to an outlaw. The sums being whispered now were obscene, enough to buy a new farm, pay off a house, restart a life. Betrayal began to seep into his world like water into a cracked hull. Men who smiled at him across card tables pressed their palms against damp pockets where letters from federal agents rested, promising leniency or reward in exchange for a single piece of information. Where he would be tomorrow. Floyd understood this as clearly as any war general reading enemy movements. In the solitary stretches between towns, the road humming beneath his tires, he replayed conversations, watched again in his mind the flick of a man's eyes, the nervous tap of fingers on a glass. Trust narrowed to almost nothing. The only constant still left to him was the gun at his side and the horizon ahead. And yet, even as danger thickened around him, there were moments when the world outside his fugitive life tried to force itself back in. A radio in a cafe crackled with news about the New Deal, about government programs promising to put men back to work. On a street corner, a vendor hawked newspapers with headlines about Wall Street wobbling back to its feet. Somewhere far beyond the dust and fear, the country was trying to heal, to forget the blood on its sidewalks and the men who had spilled it. Floyd listened to those fragments of optimism with an expression that was impossible to read. Part of him knew that if the economy truly recovered, the space for men like him would shrink even further. Another part hurt with a deeper, quieter ache, the knowledge that this new future being built would likely never have a place for him. He had tied his fate to the desperation of a nation, and if that desperation faded, his reason for being, his crooked justification for his crimes, faded with it. But there was no time for philosophy on the run. The Bureau, stung by past embarrassments and fueled by Hoover's growing hunger for a decisive win, was bending all its new authority toward him. Agents who had never held guns before were now being drilled in marksmanship. Men who had once shuffled papers behind desks were learning to kick down doors in the dark. Bulletproof vests, fast new cars, expanded jurisdiction, it was all being forged in the same fire. A single, simple promise that men like Pretty Boy Floyd would not be allowed to ride the backroads forever. Hoover had decided that the era of outlaws was going to end, and he intended to end it by turning Floyd's capture or death into a national spectacle, a piece of theater that would scare any future folk hero back into anonymity. The question, as the summer of 1934 approached, was not if the storm would catch up with Floyd, but when and where the lightning would finally strike. By the early autumn of 1934, the walls around Pretty Boy Floyd had shrunk to a thin, jagged circle of cornfields, backroads, and fading loyalties, and the man who had once seemed to glide above the chaos of the Great Depression now moved like a hunted animal through a world that no longer believed in outlaws, only in headlines and retribution. The federal government had already brought down John Dillinger in a blaze of gunfire outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago, and Bonnie and Clyde had been torn apart by bullets on a lonely Louisiana road. Floyd was next on Edgar Hoover's list, not merely as a wanted fugitive, but as a symbol that needed to be ceremoniously destroyed. His photograph, that strangely handsome, almost boyish face, stared out from post office walls and the front pages of newspapers from Oklahoma to New York under the bold, unforgiving label of public enemy. Hoover's agents, newly emboldened and eager to prove that the Bureau was no longer a timid, desk-bound organization, pushed deeper into rural territory than federal men had ever gone before. They rode in fast cars down dirt tracks, trampled through orchards and soybean fields, interrogated farmers on front porches, and flashed badges in towns where no government official had ever bothered to set foot. To the Bureau, Floyd was a fugitive to be cornered. To many of the poor people whose doors they knocked on at night, he was still the man who had once burned mortgage papers and left behind envelopes of cash. Those conflicting images collided in every farmhouse kitchen where agents demanded answers and families shook their heads and swore they knew nothing. Somewhere on those same backroads, Floyd was listening to the sound of that tightening net. He had lost friends, lost hideouts, and lost the small luxuries that had once made life on the run bearable. What remained was raw survival. He slept shallowly, waking at the smallest creak of a floorboard or the distant rumble of an engine. He changed cars as often as he changed counties, knowing that any vehicle he used too long would soon be described in detail over crackling radio lines. He still carried himself with that same calm in front of others, still wore the mask of the unshaken outlaw, but in the flicker of his eyes as he scanned a room, or in the way his hand hovered just a fraction closer to his gun than it once had, the strain showed. Fate caught up with him in Ohio, far from the Oklahoma hills that had shaped him, far from the wheat fields where his legend had first taken root. On October 18, 1934, a car carrying Floyd and two companions crashed near Wellsville, Ohio, after a high-speed chase with lawmen who had recognized him. One of the men was killed, another captured, and Floyd vanished into the nearby woods, fleeing on foot into a rural landscape he did not know. For days he moved through orchards, fields, and small patches of woodland, stealing apples from trees, drinking from creeks, and evading farmers who had been warned that a dangerous outlaw was on the loose. Somewhere between those trees, the man who had robbed banks with almost theatrical confidence and handed out money to the desperate was reduced to a lone figure slipping between tree trunks, clothing torn and dirty, boots worn thin, breath visible in the cooling autumn air. In those final days, stories later emerged of him appearing at a farmhouse, politely asking for food, insisting that he meant no harm, promising to be gone before dawn. Whether every detail of those accounts is true or not hardly matters now. What matters is that they fit the pattern of a life where violence and odd flashes of kindness had always walked side by side. Meanwhile, the Bureau's most recognizable face, Agent Melvin Purvis, fresh from the victory of the Dillinger case, was on the move. Purvis, along with fellow agent Sam Cowley and a squad of federal men and local officers, triangulated reports, followed rumors, and traced Floyd's path across the Ohio countryside like men tracking a wounded wolf. Each time a farmer mentioned a stranger in the orchard, each time someone whispered about a man sleeping in a barn, the circle tightened another notch. Finally, on October 22, 1934, that circle closed in a field near East Liverpool, Ohio. Floyd had been spotted near a farmhouse, and local lawmen moved fast, racing to cut him off before he could disappear back into the trees. He tried one last, desperate escape across an open field, running low and fast, the same way he had always run, trusting in his legs and his instincts. But the field offered him no cover, only bare ground and brittle grass, and this time the guns pointed at him belonged not to bank guards or rival criminals, but to federal agents who had come with one intention: not to wrestle him into handcuffs, but to bring him down and keep him down. Shots cracked across the quiet countryside, slamming into his back and legs, driving him to the earth. When the dust settled, Floyd lay in the grass, badly wounded, unable to run any farther. Accounts of what happened next are tangled in argument, accusation, and self-serving testimony. Some say he reached for his gun and was shot again. Others insist he was already disarmed, that what followed was not a firefight, but an execution carried out under the open sky. Official reports claim he died quickly, felled in battle like a dangerous animal at last contained. But whispers spread that he had tried to stand, that he had been questioned as he lay there, and that more bullets were fired into a man who was no longer a threat to anyone but the legend that might have survived him. What is certain is that people came running from nearby farms and roads to see the outlaw whose name they had heard 100 times over crackling radios, now bleeding into the Ohio soil. Some stared in awe, some in grim satisfaction, and some with a strange, sorrowful curiosity, as if they were witnessing not just the death of a man, but the end of something bigger, the last breath of an era when the poor clung to the idea that someone, however flawed, might strike back for them. Floyd, according to witnesses, still had enough strength to speak a few words, to give his name, to insist on who he was even as life began to ebb from his body. There was no courtroom, no jury, no final speech delivered from a stand. Just a field, a circle of guns, and a man who had lived too fast for the world he was born into. By the time they loaded his body up and drove it away, the transformation from Charles Arthur Floyd, human being, to Pretty Boy Floyd, completed myth, was already underway. Newspapers rushed out extra editions, their presses working overtime to turn blood into ink and ink into history. Some painted him as a savage killer finally brought to justice, a monster whose death should be celebrated. Others could not quite let go of the image of the outlaw who supposedly tore up mortgage papers and shared stolen money with the poor. In the towns and backroads of Oklahoma, men stood silently over breakfast tables, reading the headlines with tight jaws, remembering stories their neighbors had told, of Floyd laughing with their children, of Floyd giving them money for flour and coal. Women who had once feared the banks more than they feared any gunman wiped at their eyes without quite knowing why. Children peered at the grainy pictures of his face and asked questions their parents struggled to answer. In Washington, Hoover claimed a victory, adding Floyd's death to the list of trophies that prove his bureau was now a hardened federal force, able and willing to hunt down the most famous criminals in America. But out on the plains and in the hills, the memory of the man refused to settle neatly into official lines. Songs sprang up, rough and plain-spoken, carrying his story into bars and living rooms, telling of a boy from Oklahoma who robbed banks but spared farmers, who died under a rain of bullets but left behind a strange trail of gratitude and fear. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between the verses and the case files. Floyd was both outlaw and avenger, both a man who pointed guns at strangers and a man who slipped money into the hands of the desperate. He had chosen violence, and violence had claimed him in return. In the end, the Great Depression moved on without him, the roads he once raced down eventually paved, the small towns he passed through swallowed by time and modernity. But if you listen closely, in the old stories told in low voices on long winter nights, his shadow is still there, a lean figure on a dusty road, a bank door swinging open, a desperate country watching a criminal and trying to decide whether to hate him, fear him, or thank him. Pretty Boy Floyd died in an Ohio field, but the argument over what he really was, hero, villain, or some uneasy mixture of both, never quite died with him.